Welcome to Boring History, where we turn the dustiest battles into quiet stories for your mind. Today, we unravel Napoleon's 12-hour struggle at the Battle of Marengo, a clash that began as defeat and ended as a turning point in European history. Napoleon Bonaparte, by the summer of 1800, had already carved his name into the shifting fabric of European politics and war. He was a man who rose from obscurity to command the fate of nations, who wrapped himself in the glow of military genius and political ambition. Yet even a figure as calculating and sharp as Napoleon was not immune to surprise, and the Battle of Marengo stands as a reminder that history often bends on the moments when even the greatest leaders are caught unprepared. To understand the scale of that unpreparedness, it is necessary to picture the scene not as an instant of shock, but as a slow, unfolding trap laid by the Austrians, and sprung at the very moment Napoleon believed himself to be secure. Northern Italy in 1800 was a land crisscrossed by rivers, open fields, scattered villages, and rolling countryside, a contested space between France and Austria where armies had marched and countermarched for years. Napoleon, newly installed as first consul after the coup of 18 Brumaire, sought not only military victory, but also political legitimacy. His Italian campaign of that year was intended to secure French dominance in the region, push back Austrian influence, and remind the world that he was not merely a political opportunist, but the same soldier who had dazzled Europe in his earlier Italian campaigns. He planned carefully, crossing the Alps in a feat that was later mythologized in art and memory, positioning himself to strike decisively. Yet in June, as the days grew longer and the fields of Piedmont ripened under the early summer sun, Napoleon's confidence masked the fact that his enemy was closer and more prepared than he realized. The Austrian commander, General Michael von Melas, was an experienced soldier of the old order, cautious yet deliberate, commanding an army that was larger than Napoleon's and entrenched in northern Italy. Melas, though advanced in years, understood the strategic importance of Marengo, a small village that sat near the plain of Alessandria, not far from the Bormida River. It was there that the Austrians consolidated their strength, intending to burst forth and break the French hold. Napoleon believed he had positioned his forces effectively, yet intelligence at the time was fragmentary, messengers were delayed, and reconnaissance was imprecise. The fog of war, both literal and figurative, clouded his perception. Napoleon had deployed his men across a broad front, not expecting the Austrians to move as swiftly or as aggressively as they did. He believed the Austrian army, weakened by earlier maneuvers and hampered by its aging commander, would not risk a full-scale offensive. He assumed they would retreat further east, perhaps toward Mantua, allowing him to secure the region with relatively little resistance. But in this assumption, Napoleon misjudged both the resolve of Melas and the readiness of the Austrian forces under his command. The trap was set not with brilliance but with determination, and it caught Napoleon precisely because he underestimated the will of his opponent. The night before the battle, the French army rested in relative calm, spread out across the countryside, some near Marengo itself, others positioned at a distance. There was no sense of imminent disaster among the French ranks. Soldiers tended to their meals, officers wrote dispatches, and the long day gave way to the cool quiet of an Italian evening. Across the river, however, Austrian troops were stirring, preparing to cross the Bormida in force. Their artillery was made ready, infantry lined in columns, cavalry horses restless as the night deepened. Melas, despite his age and fatigue, had resolved to attack at dawn, striking at the heart of the French positions before Napoleon could gather his scattered units into a unified line. When the first Austrian columns began to advance on the morning of June 14, 1800, the French were not expecting a blow of such magnitude. The crossing of the Bormida was difficult, the bridges narrow, yet the Austrians pushed across with determination. Soon, the air was filled with the rumble of guns, the crack of muskets, and the shouted commands of officers rallying their men. Napoleon, informed of the movement, realized too late that the Austrians were not retreating but advancing in force. His confidence, so carefully cultivated, faltered as he grasped that his enemy was closer and more numerous than his intelligence had suggested. The French forward positions near Marengo were the first to feel the weight of the Austrian attack. Villages that had seemed quiet were suddenly alive with musket fire, as Austrian infantry pressed forward in dense formations. Artillery thundered across the fields, scattering earth and men alike. French soldiers, many of them veterans hardened by earlier campaigns, were nonetheless pressed back, confused by the sudden ferocity of the Austrian onslaught. Officers scrambled to impose order, but the weight of numbers bore down heavily. The Austrians had chosen their moment well, launching their assault when French forces were dispersed, their commander caught in the space between confidence and reality. Napoleon rode swiftly to the front, attempting to assess the situation and impose control. His presence inspired his men, as it often did. But the truth was unavoidable. He had been caught off guard, and his army was in danger of collapse before the battle had even properly begun. Reports streamed in from across the field, each carrying grim news: positions overrun, lines faltering, reserves not yet in place. His marshals, men like Victor and Lannes, struggled to hold their troops together against the sheer pressure of Austrian numbers. The air grew thick with smoke, the ground churned beneath the feet of thousands of men, and the battle unfolded not as a carefully managed engagement, but as a desperate struggle for survival. What made the surprise so devastating was not merely that the Austrians attacked, but that they attacked with precision at a point where Napoleon was weakest. The Bormida River, once assumed to be a barrier, had instead become a springboard for Austrian aggression. Their columns poured across relentlessly, pushing the French back step by step. Fields that had been green and open at dawn were soon littered with fallen soldiers, abandoned equipment, and the shattered remains of artillery. For Napoleon, the reality was stark. He had underestimated his enemy, and now he was paying the price in blood and ground lost. The French retreat in the early hours of Marengo was not a rout, but it was close. Units fell back under pressure, some breaking into disorder, others retreating in relatively good order, but unable to stem the tide. Napoleon moved among them, rallying where he could, sending aides galloping with orders, shifting reserves from one threatened point to another. Yet every effort seemed only to slow the inevitable. The Austrians, emboldened by their success, pressed harder, driving the French ever further from their initial positions. Each moment revealed the depth of Napoleon's miscalculation, the degree to which he had been caught off balance by the suddenness and scale of the Austrian assault. And yet, in those long hours of the morning, the image of Napoleon as the untouchable strategist was cracked but not broken. He adapted, he endured, he sought to buy time. But the essential truth remained clear. The Battle of Marengo began with Napoleon caught unaware, his forces battered by an enemy he had underestimated, his plans shattered in the first hours of combat. The French soldiers who fought under him that day could not have known how the tide would turn later, but in those opening hours, they fought not for victory, but for survival, dragged into a battle their commander had not anticipated, against an opponent whose strength he had dismissed too lightly. The opening Austrian assault had driven the French back across the fields of Marengo, and as the morning bled into the long stretch of the day, the struggle became not one of conquest but of sheer survival. Napoleon's army, though famed for its discipline and energy, found itself compressed under the weight of numbers, pressed backward step by step, every moment a test of endurance. Retreat in battle is not a simple act of turning and running. It is a tense, grinding movement, half fighting, half falling back, with soldiers glancing over their shoulders, commanders shouting for order, and the enemy pressing relentlessly forward. For the French on that June day, the hours were long, the sun unyielding, and the Austrians relentless in their pursuit. The fields around Marengo were filled with choking dust, stirred by thousands of feet and hooves, mixed with the acrid smoke of gunpowder. The French soldiers, wary yet bound to their duty, marched backward as they fired, holding their lines as best they could. Drums beat, officers tried to keep cohesion, yet gaps opened, men faltered, and positions once thought defensible crumbled under the weight of Austrian pressure. Napoleon's marshals were forced to make constant choices, shifting battalions to plug holes, ordering cavalry to charge in desperate attempts to stall the enemy, then falling back once more. The rhythm of the day was one of strain, withdrawal, and fleeting resistance, punctuated by moments of chaos when Austrian forces broke through. General Victor's corps, placed in the front line at the beginning of the battle, bore the brunt of the retreat. His divisions, already stretched thin, were steadily ground down, their numbers diminished as casualties mounted. The village of Marengo itself became a point of bitter fighting, its narrow streets echoing with musket fire, its houses battered by cannon shot. French troops defended the place fiercely, clinging to walls and windows, trading fire with advancing Austrians. But as the hours passed, even Marengo could not be held. The defenders, outflanked and exhausted, were compelled to fall back, leaving the village to their enemies. Each step backward carried the weight of defeat. Yet the French did not collapse. They fought. They yielded ground grudgingly, always seeking to buy more time. Napoleon himself was in constant motion, riding across the battlefield, rallying broken units, sending aides to deliver frantic orders, encouraging men who looked to him as the anchor of their resolve. He could not afford despair, though the reality of the situation pressed heavily upon him. His army was being forced into a slow retreat that could, if unchecked, become a rout. The Austrian commander Melas believed that victory was already within his grasp, and he pressed forward with renewed vigor, confident that Napoleon's famed brilliance was being ground to dust under the weight of Austrian steel. The French retreat stretched into the midday hours, and the sun climbed high in the sky, beating down mercilessly on men already drained by the struggle. The fields shimmered with heat, the wounded cried out for water, horses stumbled in exhaustion. Soldiers who had marched and fought through countless campaigns found themselves pushed to the limits of endurance. Yet Napoleon's ability to hold fragments of his army together prevented total collapse. Where one regiment faltered, another was placed behind it. Where cavalry threatened to roll up the flanks, French squadrons countercharged just long enough to allow the infantry to fall back. It was a grim bullet of survival, with every movement designed to delay, to slow, to deny the Austrians the decisive breakthrough they sought. For the Austrian side, the battle seemed to be unfolding as a triumph. Melas, despite his age and fatigue, had committed his men fully, and the results were plain. The French line bent backward, villages and fields once held by Napoleon's men now lay in Austrian hands. Prisoners were taken in numbers, captured guns bore witness to the severity of the French plight. Austrian officers urged their men onward, pressing harder, believing that the destruction of the French army was at hand. Yet even in victory, their progress was costly. French resistance, though stubbornly defensive, exacted a toll in blood. Every village seized had to be fought for. Every field won only after volleys and charges that left Austrian casualties scattered across the ground. As the day dragged forward, the French line retreated further east, bending toward the plain behind San Giuliano. Units that had begun the morning in close order now fought in fragments, battalions intermingled, officers directing men from multiple regiments simply to hold together a semblance of order. The French artillery, though heavily pressed, continued to fire as it retreated, limbering and unlimbering as gunners struggled to prevent their guns from being overrun. The thunder of cannon echoed without pause, the ground trembling beneath each discharge, the smoke hanging thick over the fields until the sun was dimmed behind a haze of powder. Napoleon knew that his army could not continue in such a manner indefinitely. Retreat had its limits. Every backward step drew his men closer to a point where the army might shatter altogether. Yet he clung to the hope that time itself might serve as his ally. Reinforcements, delayed in arriving, might yet reach the field. If he could preserve enough of his force until then, the day might still be salvaged. Thus he poured every ounce of energy into maintaining cohesion, urging his generals to hold firm despite the overwhelming pressure. His words, his presence, his reputation still carried weight. Soldiers looked at him, battered though they were, and found reason to endure a little longer. The French cavalry under Kellerman and Desaix's infantry, though not yet engaged, lingered as a possibility. Napoleon knew their arrival might mean the difference between annihilation and survival. But as the hours passed, there was no sign of them on the field. The men who were present bore the full burden of the retreat. From the front ranks, the experience was one of exhaustion and constant threat. Muskets grew filed with repeated firing, powder ran low, bayonets were fixed as units prepared for hand-to-hand combat. The cries of officers, the screams of the wounded, the neighing of terrified horses, and the ceaseless roar of cannon made the battlefield a place of unrelenting noise and pressure. Still, the retreat continued in measured stages, each withdrawal covered by the rearguard. The French army, though battered, demonstrated discipline remarkable under such conditions. Units did not dissolve entirely. They bent, they staggered, but they did not vanish. Austrian troops, confident of victory, sometimes advanced too quickly, only to be checked by a sudden counterattack that forced them to regroup. The result was a rhythm of attack and pause, charge and recoil, that stretched across the hours like the beating of a weary drum. The longer it continued, the more the French suffered, but the more time Napoleon gained. For the men in the ranks, the experience of survival was immediate and personal. They thought less of the grand strategy and more of the simple demands of endurance. Each musket shot, each step backward, each desperate glance toward their comrades was part of a long chain of moments where survival outweighed glory. They carried their packs, their weapons, their fear, and their hope, pressed by an enemy that seemed unending. Dust coated their faces, sweat soaked their uniforms, powder blackened their hands. And still they moved, step by step, through the grinding ordeal of retreat. By mid-afternoon, the French position had contracted into a more compact line, pulled back near San Giuliano. The Austrians pressed against them, sensing final victory, but the French continued to hold. Napoleon himself appeared calm to those around him, though within he weighed the possibility of defeat. He was not immune to the reality that his army had been caught off guard in the morning, and had spent the entire day fighting merely to stave off destruction. His greatness, however, lay in refusing to let despair govern his actions. He did not collapse, did not flee, did not yield to the sense of inevitability that seemed to hang over the field. Instead, he demanded of his men what he demanded of himself: survival, endurance, the will to fight another hour, another moment until fortune might shift. The hours lengthened, and the French continued their retreat. The Austrians pressed harder, yet their own exhaustion began to show. No army can fight forever without pause, and the effort of constant advance took its toll. Men dropped from heat and fatigue. Officers struggled to keep their regiments intact amid the chaos. Though Melas believed victory was near, his army too was strained, stretched across the battlefield in pursuit of an enemy that refused to die. The French retreat, though bloody, denied the Austrians the swift and total triumph they had sought. What unfolded instead was a prolonged ordeal, a contest of survival that tested the endurance of both armies, a day-long retreat where every moment was paid for in sweat and blood. As the long day of June 14 stretched toward its later hours, the French army clung stubbornly to survival, battered but not destroyed, retreating yet refusing to break. Napoleon, though caught off guard in the morning, and forced into a day of fighting withdrawal, never lost sight of the possibility that salvation might come from the arrival of reinforcements. In every glance toward the horizon, in every pause between Austrian assaults, there lingered the hope that men not yet committed would reach the field in time to alter the tide. This hope was not fantasy, for Napoleon had dispatched orders and positioned forces with the expectation that some might join him if the battle lasted long enough. The ordeal of survival was endured partly because of that fragile belief that if the army could hold together until evening, help might finally arrive. The French soldiers who had endured the retreat had little knowledge of what lay beyond their immediate struggle. For them, the day was a succession of musket volleys, artillery barrages, shouted orders, and desperate stands. Yet above the smoke and dust, aides de camp galloped with dispatches, couriers sped across the countryside, and distant formations were summoned toward the field. One such force was led by General Louis Desaix, a commander trusted by Napoleon for his steadiness, his courage, and his unshakable loyalty. Desaix had been ordered earlier to cover approaches to the south, a measure meant to guard against Austrian movements that might outflank the French position. In consequence, his corps was absent from the early stages of the battle, marching along country roads far from the thunder of cannon. As the morning's disaster unfolded, Desaix received word of Napoleon's plight. His men, weary from their own marches, were turned back toward the sound of guns. Their arrival would not be swift, for armies of the era moved at the pace of men on foot and horse, drawn artillery, slowed by dust, by heat, by the natural limits of endurance. Yet they marched with urgency, driven by the knowledge that their comrades were locked in battle, that the fate of the day might hinge upon their presence. Across fields and through villages they pressed forward, muskets on their shoulders, drums beating the cadence of their advance, while the distant cannon fire grew louder with every mile. Meanwhile, Napoleon endured the full burden of the retreat. His army had contracted into a tighter position, but its losses were grievous. Guns had been abandoned under pressure, villages lost, lines bent and re-formed again and again. He rode among his men, urging them to hold, to fight, to give him just a little more time. Behind the mask of composure, he waited anxiously for signs of reinforcements. In those hours, the thought of Desaix was never far from his mind, for Napoleon knew that only fresh troops could restore balance to the contest. Without them, the day would end in ruin. The Austrians, convinced that victory was assured, continued their relentless push. Melas, though aged and exhausted, believed that Napoleon's army was finished. He even prepared to leave the battlefield in the hands of his subordinates, certain that the outcome was secure. His men pressed forward with cries of triumph, banners unfurled, muskets flashing in the sun. The French continued to give ground, but their resistance remained stubborn enough to deny the Austrians the quick, decisive annihilation they craved. The battlefield stretched into a tableau of exhaustion, soldiers stumbling through smoke, officers rallying fragments of broken regiments, cannon booming from one end of the field to the other. In that chaos, time was being bought, and into that time marched Desaix. By the later hours of the afternoon, the dust rising from his approaching columns signalled hope. To the wary French, it meant that they were not alone, that help had come at last. Desaix's men, though tired from their march, entered the field with determination. They saw before them an army on the brink, comrades who had endured an entire day of retreat, men whose uniforms were torn and blackened, whose faces bore the grime of powder and sweat. Into this scene they came, fresh enough to form ranks with confidence, disciplined enough to march straight into the heart of the storm. Desaix himself was a figure of calm resolve. He spoke with Napoleon briefly upon arriving, assessing the dire state of the field, and then offered a remark that would later echo through history. He observed that the battle seemed lost, but there was still time to win another before the day was done. It was a statement not of despair, but of determination, a recognition that with fresh troops and renewed energy, the French might yet transform disaster into victory. His presence alone steadied Napoleon, who had clung for hours to the fragile hope of reinforcement. Now that hope had substance, and the possibility of reversal emerged from the haze of smoke and defeat. The reinforcements were not numerous compared to the size of the armies engaged, but their value lay in their freshness, their cohesion, and the spirit they carried. After a day of constant retreat, the French army desperately needed such strength. Desaix's infantry formed in steady lines, their bayonets glinting in the fading light, their muskets ready. With them came artillery, brought into position to support the counterstroke Napoleon was already planning. And with them too came cavalry, under the command of Kellerman, waiting for the moment when a decisive charge might shatter the Austrian advance. For the Austrians, the arrival of reinforcements was an unwelcome shock. They had believed the French beaten, their lines shattered, their spirit broken. To see new columns arriving, steady and determined, was to realize that the day was not yet won. Still they pressed on, confident that their superiority in numbers and the ground already taken would secure them the final victory. They did not yet recognize how the balance of endurance was shifting, how the long hours of fighting had worn them down, while the French now possessed troops unbroken by the day's ordeal. The arrival of Desaix's men infused new energy into Napoleon's plans. He reorganized his line, blending the remnants of the battered divisions with the fresh troops, preparing for a decisive counterattack. Artillery was massed, cavalry held ready, infantry positioned to strike at the vulnerable points of the Austrian advance. The French soldiers who had survived the retreat now looked upon their new comrades with relief, as though the very sight of them gave renewed strength to arms that had nearly faltered. The battlefield, which for hours had seemed a scene of inevitable defeat, now held within it the glimmer of a different possibility. As the afternoon shaded toward evening, Napoleon prepared to launch the counterstroke that would define the battle. Desaix's reinforcements had given him the means, but their mere presence was not enough. They had to be committed at the right moment, in the right place, with the precision and determination that could reverse a day of retreat. The Austrians, stretched and weary from their pursuit, presented opportunities that a sharp blow might exploit. For Napoleon, who had endured humiliation and surprise in the morning, the arrival of reinforcements was not only salvation, but also the spark of renewed ambition. The chance to transform disaster into triumph now lay within his grasp, and the stage was set for the desperate struggle that would follow. The battlefield that had echoed all day with retreat and survival now shifted into something altogether different. For the arrival of Desaix's corps and Napoleon's decision to seize the moment transformed the French army from hunted to hunter. The Austrians, believing themselves on the brink of complete victory, were stretched forward across ground littered with the remains of battle, their formations scattered by the long pursuit, their officers certain that the enemy had no strength left to resist. They did not yet realize that the French line, bent and battered, now had a solid spine of fresh troops at its heart, that the exhausted survivors of the retreat had been gathered and stiffened into a fighting shape once more, and that Napoleon, who had spent the entire day clinging to survival, now prepared to launch a counterstroke that would alter not only the course of the battle, but the shape of his legacy. The transition was not sudden to the eye of the soldier in the ranks, for it came after hours of relentless combat, the sun dipping lower, the smoke drifting heavier, the battlefield stretching in confusion. But to Napoleon it was the precise moment he had awaited. The Austrians, overconfident, pressed further, their lines elongated, their cohesion weakened by the long day's advance. Melas himself, believing the matter decided, had withdrawn from the field to rest, leaving the continuation of the pursuit in the hands of his subordinates. What they pursued was no longer a collapsing enemy, but an army braced to turn upon them. Desaix's fresh infantry, positioned at the centre, advanced in firm lines, their bayonets fixed, their muskets levelled. The battered remnants of earlier divisions formed on either side, lending their firepower to the renewed push. French artillery, massed for the counterattack, opened with a concentrated barrage that tore into Austrian ranks, halting their advance and sowing sudden disorder. For the French soldiers who had endured the long retreat, this reversal was electrifying, though it came in silence and exhaustion rather than cheers. They lifted their muskets once more, steadied by the sight of comrades advancing beside them, and pressed forward into the storm. At the heart of the counterattack was Desaix himself, a figure of calm determination. His voice carried across the ranks, urging his men to stand firm, to drive forward, to seize the chance that had been bought with so many hours of suffering. He had brought with him not only fresh troops, but also a sense of resolve, a reminder that battles could be won even when all seemed lost. Yet fate is cruel in war, and as the French surged forward, Desaix was struck by an enemy ball and fell lifeless to the ground. His men, shocked by the loss, did not falter. If anything, his death hardened their resolve, for they knew that the moment demanded all their strength, that the sacrifice of their commander could only be honored by pressing on without hesitation. Napoleon, informed of Desaix's fall, did not allow grief to slow the momentum. He absorbed the loss in silence, understanding the cost, but knowing that the opportunity Desaix had created had to be seized without pause. The counterattack rolled onward, the French infantry advancing step by step, volleys tearing into Austrian lines, the artillery hammering relentlessly. The Austrian troops, already worn by the day's fighting, staggered under the unexpected weight of fresh resistance. They had pressed for hours against an enemy in retreat, and now they found themselves struck in the chest by a renewed assault. Confusion spread through their ranks as officers struggled to impose order, drums beat frantically, and men who had believed victory assured suddenly felt the ground shift beneath their feet. It was at this moment that Kellermann's cavalry delivered the decisive stroke. With precision and timing that would be remembered long after, he led his squadrons in a sweeping charge that crashed into the flank of the Austrian line. The impact was devastating. Cavalry charges in the age of muskets were terrifying spectacles, and against troops already shaken, they could be ruinous. Horses thundered across the field, sabers flashed in the fading light, and the Austrian infantry, caught unprepared, began to crumble. Formations that had held firm earlier in the day dissolved into confusion, muskets dropped, men scattered, and the French seized the momentum with ruthless speed. The Austrian advance, which had seemed unstoppable only hours before, collapsed into retreat. The ground they had taken at such cost was abandoned in haste, their guns left behind, their wounded scattered. French troops, their spirits revived by the sudden reversal, pressed after them, firing volleys into the fleeing masses, capturing prisoners, reclaiming villages that had been lost in the morning. The thunder of cannon gave way to the cries of panic as the Austrian army, broken by the counterattack, sought only to escape. For Napoleon, the transformation was absolute. He had begun the day surprised, caught unprepared, his army driven into retreat, his reputation trembling under the weight of near disaster. By the close of the battle, he stood as the victor, his army having turned defeat into triumph through endurance, reinforcements, and the timely stroke of cavalry. The Battle of Marengo became not merely a military engagement, but a symbol of his resilience, his ability to grasp opportunity in the midst of ruin, his refusal to accept defeat even when all seemed lost. The fields around Marengo bore silent witness to the sudden change. In the morning, French troops had staggered backward through dust and smoke, pursued by an enemy confident of victory. By evening, it was the Austrians who fled, their dead and wounded left behind, their banners captured, their commanders in disarray. The French soldiers, though exhausted beyond measure, now found themselves the masters of ground they had lost, victors in a battle that had seemed beyond their grasp. They had endured a full day of retreat, only to strike in the final hours with the ferocity of men unwilling to yield their lives in vain. News of the reversal spread swiftly. To the Austrians, it was a bitter blow, for they had believed themselves on the cusp of destroying Napoleon's army. To the French, it was a triumph that confirmed their faith in their leader and restored the aura of invincibility that surrounded him. For Napoleon himself, it was more than victory, it was vindication. His political position in France had been precarious, his hold on power still new, his legitimacy untested. Marengo provided him with the proof he needed, the evidence that he was not merely a usurper of the Directory, but the indispensable commander who could deliver France from its enemies. The sudden reversal at Marengo reshaped his legacy in profound ways. It secured northern Italy for France, compelling the Austrians to negotiate and shifting the balance of power in Europe. It cemented Napoleon's reputation as a general who could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, who could remain composed under pressure, who could bend the course of history by sheer will and calculation. His enemies, who had hoped to see him broken on the fields of Piedmont, instead watched as he emerged stronger than before, his image burnished by the drama of near ruin, followed by resounding triumph. For the men who fought at Marengo, the memory of the reversal lingered as both exhaustion and pride. They had marched backward under fire for hours, believing perhaps that they were fighting a losing battle, only to feel the tide turn in an instant when reinforcements arrived and the counterattack was unleashed. They had seen comrades fall, villages lost, lines nearly broken, and yet by the end of the day they stood victorious. The cost had been terrible, the effort immense, but the victory was theirs. The name Marengo would be etched into their lives, not only as a battle but as proof of endurance rewarded, of despair overturned, of survival transformed into triumph. In the quiet that followed the retreat of the Austrians, the field was littered with the remnants of the day's ordeal. Cannons lay abandoned, muskets scattered, banners torn, bodies strewn across the fields and villages. The silence was broken only by the groans of the wounded and the cries of men searching for comrades among the fallen. Yet amid that ruin, the French soldiers knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had stood at the edge of defeat and been pulled back by the hand of fortune, by the resolve of their leader, by the arrival of reinforcements at the critical hour. The sudden reversal that reshaped the course of the battle also reshaped the course of Napoleon's destiny, fixing Marengo in history not as a defeat, but as the triumph that secured his place as master of France and architect of a new European order.